Cold Comfort, Book 3 of the America Falls series, written by Scott Medbury, narrated by Adam Barr. Part 2. 8.
What? I heard what he had said, but asking the question was like a dumb reflex. In the dim emergency lighting, I saw tears streaming down his face.
"He's dead,"
he yelled over the incessant beeping.
"It's why I took so long. I got there just before. He was sick, real sick, and that freak just fucking killed him in cold blood."
"No, it can't be," I choked. "I only just saw him a few days ago." I felt so many things right then that I didn't know how to think. Rage, grief, and regret hit me like a tsunami, and red clouded my vision. Through the fog, I saw that Luke was holding his head in his hands.
"That alarm will be for me. I couldn't stop them. I wanted to, but I saw that he was already gone before. Anyway, they heard me in the vent."
"Who was it?" I asked in a cold voice, already knowing the answer.
"The guy you talked about. The short, nerdy one."
A coldness suddenly replaced all the fiery emotions I was feeling. "Did they see you?"
"No."
He shook his head.
"I don't think so."
"Wipe your face and body and get under your covers," I ordered. The hard edge of my voice seemed to cut through the emotions Luke was feeling too, and he was already wiping his face as I snatched up the grill and put it into place before efficiently securing it. I jumped down when I was finished and threw him the knife. I had no more time to waste. I headed to the door. "Pretend you're asleep and play dumb if they come to question you." I headed out the door and began to run back towards the cafeteria when a voice behind me called my name. It was Bowman.
"Isaac, where have you been? What's going on?"
"I don't know," I said. "I was just visiting Luke to make sure he was okay when the alarm started going off." No sooner had I said the words than the alarm was silenced, and the normal lighting came back on. My relief at the termination of the high-pitched alarm was short-lived, as we heard shouting and the sound of running feet coming towards us from the direction of the square. Bowman, obviously unsure of what was happening, drew his pistol, and I followed suit. I noticed his hands trembling slightly and prayed he didn't shoot on sight. When Ragg burst around the corner and pulled to a sharp stop, I suddenly changed that prayer. His eyes fell on me immediately. A second later, he didn't even flinch as Williams and another Homeland guard rounded the corner, just about crashing into him. They both put their hands to their weapons when they saw us, and Bowman raised one hand and carefully put his sidearm away. Ragg's eyes still burned into mine, and I thought briefly of shooting him between the eyes before I, too, holstered mine. The two Homeland guys relaxed.
"What's going on?"
Bowman asked. William shrugged and looked to Ragg, who didn't answer. He simply regarded me a few seconds longer and then, without a word, pushed between us and stalked up the corridor. We all followed, me with a sinking feeling in my gut. I knew where he was heading. Less than a minute later, we arrived at the door to Luke's dormitory. Ragg swiped his card and pushed through the door without pausing. He was followed by Williams and the other Homeland guard. Both of the uniformed men had drawn their weapons, and I followed suit. I was prepared to shoot any or all of them in the back to protect Luke. Ragg paused, his head moving this way and that, appearing to take in every detail of the room. It was funny. Despite the Homeland officers being armed, I thought the unarmed Ragg with his compact, deliberate movements looked by far the most dangerous of the three men. He didn't pause long before he stalked to Luke's bed and reefed the covers down off his face.
"Where?"
Luke blinked into the light. Still wearing only his briefs, he looked vulnerable and angry all at the same time. It was his turn under the microscope of Ragg's scrutiny, but he didn't shrink from it.
"What the fuck, asshole? I'm trying to sleep."
He spat venomously and slapped at the man's hand. Luke's hand found only air as Ragg snatched his wrist, viciously twisting it and jamming it into the mattress. Luke groaned, turning onto his side to alleviate the pain. I pushed between Williams and his buddy and holstered my gun, pulling out my taser as I rushed the bow-tied bastard. He must have heard me coming and twisted sharply to face me. This time Luke screamed in agony as his arm was pulled viciously up behind his back. The sound stopped me in my tracks even as I waved my taser back and forth in front of me, the blue electricity arcing between the electrodes. We faced off, the determined look on his face almost inviting me to do my worst, welcoming it. I knew he would try and disable Luke before dealing with me, and I had to strike before he did. I saw him tense, and,
"Ragg!"
Sonny's killer froze and looked past me.
"Release the boy."
I saw a flash of something that could have been frustrated fury in Ragg's cold eyes. I didn't relax until he released his grip on Luke's wrist. Once I was sure he wasn't going to act, I turned slowly. Ragg stood up and adjusted his bow tie beside me, as though nothing had happened.
"Asshole,"
breathed Luke. The professor stood behind Williams, and I felt flames of anger licking at me when I set eyes upon his condescending face. I know what you've done. While Ragg may have been the one who had killed Sonny, it was this man who had facilitated it, and I wanted to hurt him more badly than I had ever wanted to hurt anyone. It would have to wait, though. For now, I had to pretend that I didn't know anything about what had happened.
"Sorry for the interruption, boys. We're a little on edge. Someone breached our security a little while ago. How long have you been in this room?"
He was asking both of us. The adrenaline coursing through my system made it difficult for me to come up with an immediate answer, and I was glad when I heard Bowman speak in an even tone.
"Isaac and I were on patrol, sir. We arrived here with your men. Luke was in bed sleeping."
The professor seemed to weigh this up.
"I see. What have you been doing today, young Luke?" "I've been in bed,"
said Luke, now sitting on his bed holding his arm.
"I was sleeping. At least I was until your watchdog decided he wanted a piece of me."
The professor watched Luke carefully as he spoke, and then for a few seconds after. I was probably paranoid, but I got the feeling he knew exactly what he'd been up to.
"Very well. If you're not feeling well enough to get out of your bed tomorrow, report to Dr. Radisson again, please. Come, Mr. Ragg. Let's leave this boy in peace."
He turned on his heel and began walking to the door. I couldn't just let it go at that. "Professor, before you go, when can I see Sonny?" He stopped a step from the door and took a moment before turning back to me. His face was unreadable.
"Soon. He is not feeling well at the moment. It seems he has caught some sort of bug. I'll find out from the doctor when you may be able to visit."
That he could stand there and lie to my face disgusted me. I held my tongue and prayed that Luke would do the same. In fact, I didn't trust myself to say a word. I just nodded and turned away. The professor left and was followed out by Williams and the other Homeland Guard. Ragg gazed at me for a few seconds more, and even when Luke said,
"You heard your boss, asshole. Leave us in peace,"
he left a few heartbeats later, and I exhaled heavily. I was conscious of Bowman in the doorway.
"I'll finish our shift. You see to your friend."
I nodded my thanks and waved as he closed the door. It was then that I heard Luke sobbing. I went to him. He rolled onto his back with his hands over his face. I struggled to keep my emotions in check. I sat beside him on the bunk and patted his shoulder awkwardly. "We all feel the same way, Luke. Sonny was a good man, and he deserved better than being locked up by his own countrymen and murdered."
"We have to do something about those bastards, Isaac,"
he said, finally lowering his hands. He dragged them down his face, leaving livid red marks. I know that. It was too much. Luke's pain and my own rage and loss burned me. What the hell can we do about it? He holds all the cards. We're just a bunch of stupid kids. I stood up and smashed my fist down on the table as tears of frustration and grief stung my eyes. I felt powerless, and even though I knew it wasn't my fault, I somehow felt responsible for what had happened to Sonny. I felt I had failed by not being more insistent when he was first separated from us. I vowed not to make the same mistake with the girls. We were both quiet for a while, dealing with our grief separately.
"We'll find a way,"
said Luke after a few minutes. "Sure we will," I said sarcastically. I immediately regretted it when I saw the hurt in his eyes. "Look, sorry. We will. I know we will." I got up, feeling a little more focused, and knelt beside his bunk. I stared down at the floor.
"You okay?"
"Yeah, I'll survive. What about you? How's the wound?" He lifted the cover and showed me the bloody bandage.
"I think it's worse than it looks."
He quickly pulled down the bandage to reveal the wound. Most of it was still fleshy pink fresh scar tissue, but there was a tiny amount of blood seeping from the center. "Come on, I'll take you to the showers and you can wash it and change the bandage. You do have more, right?"
"Yeah, the doc gave me 3.
"Good. Come on. After that, you should get something to eat."
"No, I think I'll just stay here."
"Come on. You can't just shut down and hide in here. It will make them suspect it was you that witnessed what happened." I had never seen him looking so down, but he nodded and stood up before gathering his stuff. I headed to the door, but he called me back. He was pulling something from under his mattress and produced a charger and the iPhone. I pocketed both items. I only found out later he had stashed the iPhone in his underwear as he crawled through the ducts. The fact that he failed to pull the phone theatrically from his underpants, or even mention it, when he gave it to me, told me how upset he was after witnessing Sonny's murder.
9.
It was almost 1600 when I dropped Luke off at the shower block. I told him I would meet him back at the rec room after I went and helped Bowman hand over to the next patrol. I ran into Bowman in the corridor leading to the lobby.
"Everything okay?"
he asked. "Yeah, he's okay," I said. I had to be careful not to say too much. All that Bowman knew was that my friend had been accosted by Ragg. "Thanks for covering me back there." He nodded as we stepped into the lift, as much to say, no problem. As we rode down the lift, I patted the iPhone in my pocket. I had carried it with me for a few days before giving it back to Luke, but hadn't had the opportunity to use it. Now, after what had happened, it seemed imperative to find a schematic of the facility and get a picture of it to Luke as soon as possible. It wasn't even a matter of hoping for things to improve now. One of our own had been killed, and our situation was untenable. We had to get out. I thought about where I might be able to locate a schematic. I hadn't seen one in Colonel Randall's office. Not anywhere obvious, anyway. If it was in the control room, I wouldn't be able to access it, period. However, the logical place for it, and one where I should be able to access without any serious dramas, was the Situation Room. Bowman and I nodded to the 2 guys on the new shift before we signed in at the front desk, Bowman writing a brief note regarding the situation with the alarm and what had happened in Luke's room. The duty sergeant, Dawes, read it and signed it off.
"Busy day, huh, boys? We thought the Chinese were invading for a minute there. The whole floor was armed and about to come to your rescue before it was called off. What the hell was it?" "Ask the professor," Bowman said. "He said someone breached security but wouldn't give us any details." "Well, screw that bastard then. They can sort out their own issues." "Yeah."
Bowman walked off. I needed to shake Bowman off if I was going to check the Situation Room, so I quickly asked the sergeant if it was his family in the picture behind him.
"Sure is. My wife Beth, my 2 boys.
His voice hitched, and I saw tears well in his eyes.
Ron and James.
I felt like a low dog for upsetting him, barely comforted by the fact that I was doing it for a good cause. Sorry, they looked like a great family.
They were the greatest. Thanks for asking about them. I don't think of them as much as I should these days.
With a sniff, he turned and put the portrait back on the shelf. We spent a few minutes talking. I told him briefly about my family, and by the time we finished, I felt I had a pretty good grasp on the type of man he was. A good man. Thankfully, Bowman had disappeared after waiting at the door for a while. When I felt enough time had passed, I told the sergeant I would see him later and left, looking briefly over my shoulder to make sure Dawes wasn't looking, before turning right instead of left. I briskly headed towards the Situation Room. If I was intercepted, I would say I was going to see Colonel Randall about something. It seemed that luck was on my side, though. I didn't run across anybody, which was pretty unusual at that time of day. I made it all the way to Randall's office and then sprinted quietly the last few feet to the Situation Room. I paused for a second, listening for the sounds of conversation through the door. Nothing. I swiped my card, praying that it would be configured to open this door. It was. Obviously, they didn't think there was anything too sensitive in there, and I opened the door quickly and went in. The dimly lit room actually looked like a war room. There were pin boards everywhere, and most were covered with sheets of butcher's paper, drawings and maps. Taking up one complete board was a satellite image of mountain terrain giving way to green hills and a small town. The town was marked Lincoln, and the facility had been drawn in with a marker pen north of it, over the top of Drake Mountain. I could see green and red pins dotted around and in the town, and assumed they were places the Drake Mountain teams had already visited, or were to visit. I snapped a quick picture of it before moving around the room quickly. As I moved on, my heart was beating fast with adrenaline. Every second I was in there increased my chance of discovery. Finally, on the opposite side of the room, I found what I was looking for. 3 large squares of paper, each showing a different level of the facility. All 3 levels were in the same cross configuration, the mid-level lines and markings looking much as I had pictured it in my head from walking around and learning the layout. The details of the other 2 levels would be very handy indeed, though. I took a picture of each of them, slipped the iPhone into my pocket, and headed to the door. I grasped the handle of the door and was just about to pull it open when I heard muffled voices on the other side. I pulled my hand away like I'd been shocked and dived under the boardroom table, squeezing quickly between 2 chairs, and crawled under just as the door opened.
Due back in.
The overhead lights came on.
They were due back in 3 hours ago, sir. But so far the cameras in the lodge have picked up nothing.
It was John Hurst's voice.
Damn it. If they're not back by nightfall, I'll have to send you and Bowman out to see if you can locate them. They've maintained radio silence as per procedure, so I have to assume they haven't run into any trouble. But it's unusual.
I watched 2 pairs of legs move around the room.
This is the point they were heading to reconnoiter. It's about a 3-mile square radius, just a few farmhouses and a small town. I gave them more than enough time to do what they needed to do. Okay, so what is the plan, sir? I'm going to see the professor to get permission to send you out. I want you to saddle up, you and Bowman only. If we don't hear anything from them by 1800 hours, you're going out. Yes, sir. Come on, let's get moving.
I watched the booted feet head to the door. After it closed, I slowly let out the breath I'd been holding. I crawled out from under the table and stood on wobbly legs before once again listening at the door, before heading out.
10.
After a quick shower in the barracks, I headed back up to the square. I saw Luke sitting in the quiet zone reading an old book and gestured to him that I was going to get something to eat. I wolfed down a quick meal in the cafeteria, just catching the end of the first shift. Thankfully, Bowman was not there, which probably meant that John Hurst had pulled him aside to get ready for a possible rescue mission that night. I headed into the quiet zone as soon as I'd finished. It was just Luke and me. Did you have something to eat?
Yeah.
I looked at the book he had put down in his lap. Animal Farm by George Orwell. I had never studied it in high school, but had read it for fun when I was in the 7th grade. It was only short, but it left an impression on me. All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. The famous quote resonated with me now, given that Drake Mountain seemed to have one set of rules for the majority and another for the professor and his cronies. Do you think you would be up to telling me about what you saw?
Yeah, I think so.
Good. I wouldn't ask so soon, but it's important. Come on, we'll head back to your dorms so we have some privacy. Plus, I have some photos for you.
Okay, let's go,
he said, with a fraction more enthusiasm. The dorm was empty when we arrived. We sat at the table and faced each other. Take as little or as much time as you need, and tell me if you need a drink of water or anything.
You sound like a counselor,
Luke grinned, and I couldn't help but return his grin. Not because I thought his crack was particularly funny. It was just good to see him smile. He seemed to be okay once he got started, and I let him talk freely, only asking questions at certain points. After Ben had secured the grill behind him, Luke had set out on his journey in the cramped confines of the ducting. He admitted that it was a lot snugger than he had been expecting, and after only a few minutes of the awkward shuffling, he had begun to regret volunteering. The corners were the worst, and he had to negotiate one just a few feet after he had started. It had turned left and seemed to roughly follow the main corridor. After about 30 minutes of shuffling in the cramped, hot space, he had taken a right turn. By that time, he had lost all sense of direction and progress, but he thought he may have ended somewhere near the lobby. It was at that point he realized that his wound was bleeding, but couldn't be sure when it had started. He had eventually arrived at a place where his duct intersected with a bunch of others. A hub that was almost big enough for him to stand up in. He took a moment here to congratulate himself on his decision to tuck the iPhone into his briefs. Without its glow, he would have been blind. This way station, as he called it, was a large box-like structure that had ducting leading off in 4 directions, as well as a larger vertical shaft that led up to the professor's level and down into the military level. Both the upper and lower entrances were sealed by a wired mesh hatch, but thankfully had a small maintenance ladder that seemed to run the entire length of the vertical shaft. Luke took the opportunity to have a rest, stretching and taking some water while he could. He used his chalk to mark the opening he had emerged from and cursed himself when he realized he had forgotten to mark the first 2 turns he had taken. He didn't worry about that then. Plenty of time to worry about it when he was trying to find his way back. He turned his attention to the hatch leading to the upper level. It wasn't locked, just held in place by hinges and closed by 2 bolt locks. Before he opened it, Luke briefly contemplated the possibility of it being alarmed, but couldn't see any obvious wiring or cables. Besides, it wasn't as if he could or wanted to turn back after coming so far. Holding his breath, he had slipped the bolts and swung the hatch down. He didn't hear an alarm, but that didn't mean anything. It could be blaring in another part of the facility and he wouldn't know. He checked the edge of the hatch door. Definitely no wires there. Feeling a little better about it, he left the hatch hanging down behind him and began to climb. He thought it was about 20 feet before he came to another hatch. Again, a quick inspection told him it wasn't alarmed, and he unlatched it, pushing upwards. This one was heavier than he expected, and to his horror, he was unable to hold it as it fell open. He had flinched, but the crash he had expected didn't come, the hinges halting it silently an inch or so above the sheet metal of the ducting. Again, relieved and feeling more optimistic, he climbed through that hatch and found himself in another hub, this one a lot smaller. This time there were 4 ducts, each going off in a different direction. He had no idea which direction to try first, and he decided to use trial and error, hoping due to his waning strength that he picked the right opening the first or second time. He wasn't sure he would have enough energy to try more than 2 and still get back safely. Having lost all sense of direction, he wasn't even able to make an educated guess. So at that point, he had resorted to eeny, meeny, miny mode to decide which duct to explore. It was a very Luke thing to do, and I suppressed a little chuckle when he told me. The duct he had decided upon seemed to run back in the same direction he had come from on mid-level, so he was quite happy with it. He had set off, and it was a good 10 minutes before he came upon the first offshoot. He took the hard right turn, and after a minute came upon a vent overlooking a vast lab. There were 5 men and a woman in lab coats and face masks working in the lab.
As you would expect, they were doing science stuff, he said. Looking in microscopes, fussing with centrifuge equipment and other stuff I didn't recognize.
While he didn't know any of the other scientists, none of us did. He had wanted to be sure that Professor Leahy wasn't in there. He didn't really learn anything else of value, but watched them until he could confirm that Leahy wasn't present. From his vantage, he had strained to see as far as he could to the left and saw a door in the wall on that side. That meant there might be more rooms further along the main duct. He backed carefully out the offshoot and into the main duct before proceeding further along. He eventually came to another offshoot and crawled into that. The room at the end of this was about half the size and looked more heavy-duty than the other lab he had seen. It had a glass or perspex ceiling a foot or so below the vent and seemed to be hermetically sealed. The 2 scientists in here were in full hazmat outfits, their features obscured by the fluorescent light reflected from the perspex covers over their faces. While Luke watched from that vent, a door opened with a hiss almost directly below him. A new person entered the room. This one was similarly attired and carried a small aluminum container that looked a little like a coffee flask. The newcomer took the flask over to a large desk upon which a glass box sat. It was about the size of a picnic cooler and had an oversized microscope attached to it. Luke watched the newcomer screw the flask-like object to a small circular opening on the side. He heard the newly arrived scientist tell the other 2 that this was the last blood sample and that the subject was in the final stages of the disease. "He won't see out the day." My stomach turned as Luke told me. It was Sonny they were talking about. Luke knew straight away, but at that stage had still held out a small hope that perhaps it wasn't our friend, that perhaps it was the other man Paul had seen while he was in the hospital. Luke watched as one of the other scientists had inserted his arms into 2 fist-size openings on the long side of the cabinet. Soon the thick rubber gloves inside came to life and began to move. Luke watched as they reached into the flask and removed the glass slide. He saw a smear of red on the glass and watched as the scientist deftly placed it onto the stage of the microscope inside the box.
God damn. Look at those little fuckers go. Should be dead already.
They had all laughed at this, and for a moment, Luke had thought seriously about bashing his way out of the vent and killing the bastards with his bare hands. It was Sonny, and they were laughing about it. Common sense had prevailed, and burning with a cold rage, he had backed out of the duct to the main line again. He could see no light coming from the direction that would lead further down that main duct, so awkwardly turned around so that he could crawl forwards and back to the hub on that level. Luke had another short break and some water once he got there, all the while fighting his grief and anger. At that point, time was of the essence. If he found Sonny, he could still maybe get him out of there. Luke now picked the duct immediately to the left of the first one he had chosen. It seemed logical that one of the closest 2 may lead to wherever they were holding Sonny. This time he was lucky, or unlucky, as the case may be. Luke fully admitted that by that time he was struggling. Even though his anger was fueling him to go on, He had doubts about being able to physically follow another duct if this one proved fruitless. As it was, he had to rest several times, lying still for a few minutes every 30 feet or so. After 2 such stops, he finally saw light from the opening of an offshoot duct in the distance. He entered the offshoot warily, because even before he reached it, he could hear the muffled voices. He squeezed into the slightly smaller duct and inched his way the last few feet, doing his best to control his ragged breathing. He finally reached it and slowly pressed his face to the grill, squinting to allow his eyes to adapt to the harsh artificial light. From the description that followed, I knew it was the same place I had visited Sonny the week before. Luke found himself overlooking another glass-roofed corridor. Again, it was about a foot below his vantage point. He could see that a heavy glass airlock sealed the corridor and the cells from the rest of the facility, and that it was guarded by Homeland Security. Both of the cells he looked down upon contained a cot and a sink, as well as a toilet. One thing was different, though. The cell next to Sonny's was occupied. It was a Caucasian man that Luke didn't recognize. He was skinny and pale, with thinning hair. He was sitting calmly on a chair, staring into the room next to his. The adult survivor that Paul saw in the hospital. But what about Sonny? I was unable to bear the tension of his story. He was there, in the next room. I just didn't see him at first. His voice cracked. In the other cell stood 3 men in hazmat suits. They were standing over the cot. It was then that Luke observed the shape of a body under the blanket, wires stretching from it to a vital sign monitor standing just beside the cot. As he watched, trying to make out for sure if it was Sonny, the figure beneath the blanket coughed, a harsh, phlegmy cough not dissimilar to that his parents had displayed in the hours before their death. Luke could see a spray of bloody mucus on the wall by the bed. Whoever the person under the blanket was, they couldn't be far from death now. Luke began crying.
I mean, I knew it was him. I just couldn't admit it to myself, as if admitting it would make it true.
I didn't try to console him. I knew nothing I could say or do would help. We kind of had to face up to the terribleness of it to get past it. Luke had paused for a moment, gathering himself before continuing with his tale. Even though they were behind glass and their voices muffled by the filtration devices on their masks, he could just make out what the 3 men were saying. The tallest figure turned to the one carrying a clipboard.
How long has it been?
26 hours and 19 minutes since infection, sir.
Not as quick as I had hoped. How long before he was incapacitated?
Well, because he was confined to a cell, it's hard to put an exact timeline on it. In a real-world situation, he would possibly have stayed mobile for longer, but he hasn't gotten out of the cot since 18 hours and 27 minutes post-infection.
How long now?
Judging by his vital signs, he should decease within 30 minutes. As they were talking, a series of harsh coughs racked the person under the blanket who then, with a supreme effort, threw the blanket aside. It was Sonny, or more accurately, the hollow shell of Sonny. Luke hardly recognized him. Our friend was emaciated, and his skin was an unhealthy gray color. He was covered in a sheen of sweat.
His face was the worst,
Luke said, with tears in his eyes.
He looked like a zombie. There were dark shadows under his eyes, and he had blood and green snot running out of his nose down onto his mouth and chin.
To the surprise of the men standing over him, Sonny had managed to make it into a sitting position and looked defiantly at his tormentors.
Congratulations,
he had gurgled.
You've done it. How does it feel to be?
At this point, he began coughing. Blood and mucus sprayed from his mouth, and 2 of the men stepped back sharply while the third stood his ground, wearing the spray of gore on the legs of his protective suit.
Murderers!
Well, I think that's enough,
said the tall figure, ignoring Sonny's question.
Incapacitation is the important milestone, not when they finally expire.
He nodded to the man who had been splattered by Sonny's cough.
End it, Mr. Ragg.
The man holding the clipboard had reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a syringe, offering it to Mr. Ragg. Here. Luke had gripped the grill of the vent and began to strain against it. Ragg had turned, and through his perspex mask, Luke had seen a humorless smile on his face as he turned away from the other man without taking the syringe. As Ragg turned to him, a shivering Sonny had fought his way to his feet. It seemed he had decided he wouldn't make it easy for them. He stood swaying slightly, his feet apart, and brought his closed fists up. It was a supreme effort of mind over matter, and for just that one brief moment, Luke dared to hope. That hope was shattered when Ragg walked purposefully to Sonny, brushing aside his feeble punch and gripping the sick man's head in both of his gloved hands. He held him that way for a moment, oblivious to Sonny's weak blows on his shoulders and side. Then he viciously twisted his hands. The muffled crack of Sonny's neck breaking was terrible. But even more terrible was the way Ragg turned his victim's head back to face him and looked into his eyes as our friend and mentor died.
11.
No!
Luke had screamed helplessly as he struggled to push the grill out of its frame. Ragg's head whipped around, his eyes now trained on the vent. Luke swallowed a sob and ceased struggling to push his way out of the vent. Without taking his eyes off Luke's hiding place, Ragg released Sonny's head and allowed his limp body to collapse to the floor. Luke knew that the killer couldn't actually see him, but he felt like they were staring at each other. You know what, Isaac? One time when I was hunting with my dad, I nearly stepped on a copperhead snake. I was only like 12, and I froze up, scared spitless. It was just staring at me with those dead eyes, ready to strike, and I couldn't look away. Not until my dad came up and pulled me slowly away from it. That's what Ragg's eyes were like. Dead snake eyes. Luke had watched a moment longer through tear-blurred eyes before adrenaline had kicked in, and he frantically shuffled backwards along the duct, anxious to be away from the malevolent gaze of Ragg. He heard muffled yelling, and after what seemed like an eternity, reached the main duct, scrabbling around the corner and shuffling along it as quickly as he could. He had just scrambled over the edge into the upper hub when he heard a happy voice echo from behind him. "Oh, don't go. Why don't you come back and play? You can join your friend." It was Ragg, and Luke wasn't afraid to admit he nearly shat his pants. Ragg was back there and calling into the vent that Luke had so recently vacated. Energized by the adrenaline coursing through his system, he half climbed, half fell down the ladder to the main hub on the middle level without shutting the hatch behind him. He quickly pulled out his phone so he could see which of the ducts he had marked and climbed in. He heard the voice behind him again, fainter now, but somehow worse because of the creepy sing-song quality it took on. Come out, wherever you are." Luke wasn't sure if Ragg was now in the ducts and following him or still calling out from the vent, but he didn't plan to hang around and find out. He took off, crawling and scrabbling back the way he had come. He didn't stop to rest until he reached a junction of 3 shafts, and even then, it was through necessity. He had forgotten to mark this spot with his chalk. He sat there, frustrated and cursing for valuable seconds, trying to figure out which one it was. The stakes were high. If he took the wrong duct, he could end up anywhere, and it would mean almost certain discovery if they did a head count. In the end, it was his own wound that saved him. By the light of the phone, he was able to spot a small smear of blood on the lip of one of the narrower ducts. Yes! He crawled into it and moved as quickly as he could in the more confined space, spurred on by the fact that he was almost back to the dorm. Well, you know the rest. I was numb. But whatever I was feeling must have been amplified 100 times for Luke. He was clearly traumatized by what he had seen, and I had the terrible feeling that there would be more of the same trauma to come. "You did well, Luke," I said, and patted him on the shoulder, my words sounding woefully inadequate to my own ears. He shook his head. I had to try and take his mind off what he'd experienced. "So we know they've got the virus and killed Sonny to test it. Did you see any clue about how they'll get it out there, though?" "No idea," he said, not taking his eyes off the floor. "When will this shit ever end? I hate what the Chinese did as much as anyone. But how will killing more people help?" I reflected how quickly a person's opinion could change. Just 2 months ago, I would have been all for an eye, and Luke would have cheered me on. I guess what we had experienced in the facility, the worst of human nature by our own people, had influenced us more than I thought. "Don't you get it, Isaac? It's what human beings do. We make war over and over and over again. Man won't ever stop fighting until there's just a handful of us left on the whole planet. And even that won't stop them. Then it will be over a girl or food or shelter. Albert Einstein said he didn't know what weapons would be used to fight World War III, but he knew that World War IV would be fought with sticks and stones." We were silent for a few moments. "You know we have to stop him, right?" "I don't see how we can stop him, Luke. We couldn't even save Sonny." "Isaac, we can't just let them unleash the virus, no matter what their government did to us. What would it achieve to kill all those people? We know there are people like Huion fighting their government. If the people here and any others could get in touch and work with them, there might be some sort of future for us. After all, we can't stay in here like rats in a sewer forever." "I know, but we don't have the firepower to do it. There are too many of them and they're too well equipped. If we had Randall's men on our side, it might be possible, but there is zero chance they would side with us in a fight over saving the Chinese. I think we have to look after ourselves and get the hell out of here. And soon. If we happen to give the professor and his plans a bloody nose in the process, then I'll be happy." Luke was silent for a moment, and then opened his mouth as if to argue. In the end, he closed it again without saying a word. He knew I was right. There was no way we could rally U.S. soldiers to fight the professor because he planned to use the virus on the Chinese, and definitely no way we could do it alone. "All right. What's the plan? How are we going to get out of this rat hole?" Luke seemed to shrug off the heaviness that was upon him and looked at me with a familiar fire in his eyes. Before I could answer him, we were interrupted. The soldiers on the evening patrol opened the door and allowed Ben, Paul, Bo, and Toby in. After the door was closed, Luke and I invited the boys to gather around. The 3 boys didn't actually know Sonny, but were shocked to learn he had been murdered. Ben, of course, was extremely upset and angry. I deliberately left out the part about Sonny being infected. The fewer of us that knew the professor had created a weaponized virus, the less chance of the wrong ears hearing and working out who had trespassed on the upper level. I allowed him to storm and rage for a few minutes before I stood up and grabbed him in a bear hug, as much to contain him as to comfort. It worked. He struggled for a few moments before he eventually calmed down and sobbed into my shoulder, before breaking away awkwardly, embarrassed by his tears and saying he needed to wash his face. He came back a few seconds later and sat back in on our conversation. "By the way, Paul, you were right. The other guy didn't die. The survivor adult you saw in the hospital? Luke saw him in the cell next to Sonny's, and he's alive as you or I. They must have hidden him the first time they allowed me to visit Sonny." "I knew it," Paul whispered. Even though I hadn't mentioned Sonny's deliberate infection, I could see Paul's mind ticking over, and the look on his face told me he had put 2 and 2 together. I gave a quick warning shake of my head. He nodded and stayed silent. At the moment, only he, Luke, and I knew. I would tell Ben in private, and also tell him of our decision to escape the facility. Our conversation dried up. I suddenly felt absolutely drained. I wasn't the only one. Luke looked worse than I felt. I better get back down to the barracks. You should go to bed.
12.
In the end, I decided to head to the rec room before I went back down, just to add some sort of alibi in case my long absence was noted. It probably worked out to be a blessing that Bowman had been dispatched to investigate what had happened to the scouting party. Otherwise, I'm sure it would have been difficult to shake him off, especially given our run-in with the professor's men. As it was, I found 2 soldiers, Fisk and Meeks, playing pool. I decided to play a couple of games of pool with them, so I could pick their brains and see how much they knew about what had happened earlier. They told me that John and Bowman had gone out 2 hours before, just after the alarms from Luke's adventure had been silenced. Neither of them seemed to know exactly what that had been about.
I heard it was a false alarm,
said Fisk. No, it was some sort of breach, said Meeks. Cocksucker, who knows what he's doing up there? We should be the ones breaching his ass.
Well, you might like breaching ass, Meeks, but leave me out of it.
We all cracked up. Right then, a couple of Homeland Security men came into the room and headed to the gym equipment. They were in black T-shirts and track pants, but still had their holstered weapons on their hips. Meek's buddy gestured that he should be quiet.
No,
he spat, and looked at the 2 men challengingly. Didn't you see what that little asshole Ragg did to Spence? The professor's men didn't rise to the bait. One jumped on the exercise bike and the other began pummeling the punching bag. Meeks kept up his hostile staring, perhaps trying to goad them. If they were bothered by his enmity, they didn't show it and focused on what they were doing.
Come on, Meeks. It's your shot,
said Fisk, grabbing his arm gently. The bigger soldier shook it off, but finally turned back to the game he had been playing with me. We played for another 20 minutes before the Homeland guys finished their exercise and left.
Gutless bastards,
Meeks called as they went through the door. One turned and smirked at him. I felt pretty sure they weren't gutless. More likely they had been instructed to maintain a presence but to stay well clear of the soldiers. After the professor's men had left, I asked Meeks and Fisk what they thought might have happened to the scouting party that Bowman and Hurst had gone out to find. The Chinese got him for sure, said Meeks without looking up from the shot he was lining up.
We don't know that,
said Fisk, who seemed to be the more reasonable one.
Anything could have happened. Hell, they might be on the way back now.
He didn't seem very convinced. When Fisk told us he was heading to bed, Meeks said he was hanging around. I told him I would join him. It seemed like a good opportunity to probe Meeks further. We shot the breeze for a few minutes. He was talking almost as though he were drunk, and to my surprise, when we sat down in the darkened alcove, he pulled out a glass flask of dark brown liquid and asked if I wanted a swig. I thought about saying no, but in the end took the bottle and raised it to my lips. A few seconds later, I was coughing and spluttering as the fiery liquid tried to find its way back up my esophagus. Meeks laughed and patted me on the back. You're all right, Race, even if you're not a real soldier. I didn't actually learn anything new, but I did learn a little bit about Meeks. He wasn't quite as boorish as he came across most of the time. He didn't even seem to mind that I refused to drink any more of his liquor. After another half hour or so of small talk and another game of pool, I begged off and headed back down to the barracks. Meeks stayed behind, and I wondered if he did that every night.
13.
The next day passed slowly. Because Bowman was still outside, I was partnered with Meeks for the next morning's patrol. Thanks to his liberal intake of moonshine or whatever he had been drinking the night before, he was quiet for most of our duty. I was okay with that. I had a lot of thinking to do. I didn't get a chance to talk to Luke during my shift, even though I did spy him in the rec room. Given our close encounter with Ragg and the professor the evening before, I thought it was probably a good idea to avoid each other for a few days. I didn't want to heighten any suspicions about us that they may already have, especially as there seemed to be more of the Homeland Guards on the middle level that day. I had a vague sense of uneasiness as we patrolled the middle level. It wasn't really to do with Sonny's death or the increase in numbers of the Homeland Security on our level. It was more like a sense of impending disaster. In the end, I decided that it was because I knew that we now had to try and leave Drake Mountain. The option to stay and work something out had been closed to us by the hands of a killer. I also knew that when we did try, there were only two possible outcomes. One, we would fail, and most likely some of us would be killed. Or two, we would succeed and possibly lose some of our people and end up right where we had been 6 weeks ago. I felt the weight of leadership settling on me again. Only this time it felt like there was a lot more at stake. After my shift, I went and showered before heading back to my bunk and grabbing a pencil I had secreted in my pillow slip. I took it to the bathroom with me and, sitting down on the toilet, pulled a square of paper out of the dispenser and began to scrawl a note on it. Indigo. Sonny's dead. Luke and I are working on a plan. Stay strong and look after the girls. More news soon. Be ready to move at a moment's notice. Love, Isaac. I read it back, then screwed it into a ball, dropping it between my legs into the water. I wrote it again, this time leaving out the word love. I was too embarrassed to leave it, to expose myself to possible rejection. A stupid schoolboy thing to worry about, I know, but back then it had seemed an enormously risky thing to do. That evening, I deliberately made my way up to the cafeteria early so I could line up by the time the girls finished eating. In my pocket, I had the note for Indigo. With hand in pocket, I fiddled with it nervously as I waited in line. The mining shift had joined our queue, and I turned and waved at Paul, Ben, and the others. Luke was at the very end of the line and returned my brief wave. Finally, the women finished their meal and started filing out. I waited anxiously until she came into view and then slipped the paper into the palm of my hand. As she got closer, the smile froze on my face. An ugly purple welt marred the flawless skin of her cheekbone. She smiled at me and my stomach turned. The smile seemed so at odds with the evidence of recent violence. I had planned to just slip her the paper, but I couldn't suppress the urge to step out of the line and grab her arm, pulling her into my embrace. She gasped in surprise, and I thought for a second she might pull away. But then I felt her arms encircle me and hug me close. Her body melded to mine, and the closeness of her, the scent of her, was intoxicating. My heart jumped in my chest, and when she was pulled away by the Homeland escort, a wave of anger swept over me. I held her and tried to push the guard away. He gripped me by the collar of my Army-issue shirt but seemed reluctant to engage me. "Back in line, lovebird," he said, straining. I held his eyes, on the verge of striking him, and at the same time noticed over his shoulder another guard advancing along the line towards us. It was Leroy. Great. His face was bruised around his eyes and the bridge of his nose, courtesy of his faceplant during our confrontation. He recognized me, and with his eyes burning with dumb malice, made a beeline for us. I tensed and felt Indigo's soft hand find mine. "It's okay, Isaac. I'm okay. You should see the other girl." "Oh, it was between you and another girl?" She nodded again, smiling reassuringly at me. Relieved now that the more sinister scenarios I had considered were put to rest, I slowly relaxed, as did the guard holding me. Indigo began to pull her hand away, and I grabbed it, slipping the paper into her palm before stepping back to take my place in the line again. The guard that had stepped in to separate us held up his hand like a traffic cop. "I got this, Leroy." "You sure? That one's trouble." I turned away from his aggressive stare, letting him know he was no threat to me, and watched Indigo go. When Allie and Brooke walked by, looking at me with secret smiles on their faces, I felt my own face redden. Obviously, they were more interested in me hugging Indigo than the fact that I nearly got into a fight. Beyond them, I saw Luke move back into the line, too. He had apparently been ready to come to my aid. I nodded, letting him know everything was all right. Ben waved to his sister and then gave Luke a funny look when the taller boy with the poorly done haircut bowed flamboyantly to Brooke, causing her to laugh shyly. My smile faded as I saw Paul again try to catch the eye of his sister as she passed us a few places further down from our girls. My heart went out to him when she didn't look up. It seemed impossible, but she appeared even more withdrawn than she had been the last time I had seen her. I felt anger and helplessness overtake me. It was wrong that we should be kept from our family and friends like this. The sooner we got out of there, the better. I made a promise to talk to Paul about it as soon as I could. I wanted him and his sister to come with us, and of course, Toby and Bo, too. Leroy stared at me as he walked by, but didn't say anything. I thought I saw a little respect mixed with the hatred in his eyes, and that was fine by me. I ate my meal apart from the other boys, sitting with Sergeant Dawes, who had come in just as we were entering the cafeteria. Again, I wanted to minimize suspicion in case anyone was observing us, but also I liked Dawes and knew he would be good company. He was a good talker. I asked him a question about before, and pretty soon he was telling me his family history. It was kind of comforting, and after a while I switched off and began to think about things, still half listening and nodding in the right places. I was intrigued that the matter of the security breach seemed to have been abandoned, or at least not pursued. Had they decided it was too hard to get to the bottom of? Or were they waiting for more intel before they made a move?
Well?
I looked at Dawes, who waited expectantly. Huh?
You're not listening to me, are you? A penny for your thoughts?
Oh, nothing. Sorry, just tired is all.
That's okay, son. I'm going to head back downstairs anyway. You coming?
No, I might go shoot some pool.
Okay, I'll see you later.
While I decided to lay as low as I could when it came to socializing with Luke, I didn't see a problem with being together while we were around all of our other friends during leisure time. I took my tray back to the dirty pile and nodded to Luke as I went out. I desperately wanted to talk to him so we could begin to work on our plan of escape and get his thoughts on bringing along Paul, his sister, and the two boys. I had given more thought to Luke's wish to stop the professor from using the virus on the Chinese, but no matter how much I tried to come up with something, there didn't seem to be a way we could do it. Trying to overthrow him was impossible, as was sabotaging his labs. They were just too well guarded. We had to hope that they would fail because they didn't have an effective delivery method. I went into the rec room. It wasn't too crowded, but to my dismay, I saw Maddox, the Homeland Guard that had escorted me away from the confrontation between the professor and Randall, playing pool with a buddy. There was also another guard working out on the weights in the gym area. Maddox looked up at me when I entered. I gave him a friendly smile and wave that was far from genuine, and walked to the alcove, claiming a spot on the unoccupied sofa. They didn't seem to pay any further interest in me. I selected a magazine from near the bottom of a messy stack beside the sofa. It was a dog-eared 2-year-old issue of People magazine, and on the cover was President Riley shaking hands with the Chinese president. Marriage of Convenience was the headline. I guess someone wanted a divorce, I thought. I didn't feel like reading, especially not something that reminded me so painfully of the past. I put the magazine back on top of the pile, knowing there was a good chance it would be vandalized the next time I saw it. As I sat, I mulled over ideas for our escape. I had a general notion about how we could achieve it, but I needed Luke's strategic mind to work out the nuts and bolts. I knew I could trust Ben and Luke implicitly, and I also had every confidence in Paul. His input would be invaluable given his knowledge of how things worked in Drake Mountain. I was certain he would be more than willing to come with us as long as Ava could come too. We would be the inner circle, and as we brought others into the loop, they would be given as little or as much information as they needed to perform their part when the time came. Initially, though, it needed to be the 4 of us. 15 minutes later, the others came in. To my pleasant surprise, Maddox and his playing partner left not long after. Now the only people in the rec room were myself and those from the mining shift, along with the Homeland guy who was still working out. I gestured surreptitiously for Luke, Ben, and Paul to come into the alcove with me. I saw Toby and Bo shape to come in also, but Paul had a word in their ear and they turned back to the pool table. The Homeland guard working out in the gym area didn't seem to be taking much notice, but I knew that looks could be deceiving, so I ensured that the others were relaxed and laughing as we lounged on the sofa. "We have to do something," I said, keeping a grin on my face. "No shit, Sherlock," said Luke loudly, joining in my pantomime. "And I mean something drastic," I laughed, even as I looked seriously at Paul and Ben. "Sonny is dead, and we are being kept from our people, and—" I looked at Paul pointedly. "Family. As far as I could tell, things are not going to get better down here. In fact, they will probably get worse given the disappearance of the patrol and the friction between the army and the professor's people. We have to leave." Reading Ben's thoughts, Luke butted in before he could voice his words. "Isaac's right. We might be warm and well fed down here. But ask yourself, what sort of a life will we really have? Can you see yourself chipping away at rock for the next who knows however many years? And what about Brooke? Do you want to see her impregnated by God knows who?" My warning was too late. I saw Paul's face turn ashen. Luke didn't try to cover his gaffe, although he looked regretful. "Sorry. It needed to be said," he stated quietly. Paul pushed his glasses back up his nose with a finger. "Luke's right. If I had thought there was a chance, I would have tried to escape long before now. With more of us, I think we can do it." He looked at me. "What do you have in mind?" My respect for him grew immeasurably in that moment. We sat in the alcove for the next hour and discussed and argued over how we would escape Drake Mountain, all the while trying to act as though we were just socializing. Occasionally, just to allay any suspicions, we would take turns and go out and play a game of pool. We finally reached a consensus on a course of action. Luke, Ben, and Paul would begin stockpiling anything that could be made into or used as weapons. They would begin by smuggling knives from the cafeteria at each mealtime and hiding them in the mattress of Luke's cot. As part of my new duties, I already had a pistol and a taser. I would try and obtain at least one more firearm, preferably two so that Luke and Ben were both armed. If I could get more of the tasers, I would. They might be easier to come by than guns. Paul was sure that he could persuade another group of 6 boys to come with us, but in the end, we decided that the more people involved, the more chance that word of our plan would leak out. We settled on our core group: me, Luke, Ben, Indigo, Brooke, and Allie, along with Paul, Toby, Bo, and Paul's sister, Ava. It would be a group of 10. But I was sure of the integrity of my group and their ability to keep the whole thing quiet, and Paul seemed to be just as confident in his. I felt a creeping optimism. With surprise on our side, we might just be able to pull off an escape without any casualties. Of course, our enemy, for their part, were well-trained, armed, and physically stronger than us. During our planning, I repeated again and again that surprise was an absolute necessity. The last thing we wanted was a running battle in confined spaces as we attempted to get out. We would still be outnumbered and outgunned, but if we were lucky, we could be out with minimum contact and without alerting them to the fact that anything major was happening. "So, we are going out the same way we came in?" asked Ben. "I found," Luke said. "Well, I'm pretty sure I found the emergency exit. It's not marked on the schematic, but I found an anomaly on the professor's level. A place where there should be a room, but there isn't. It's got to be it." "I don't think we can risk it," I said. "Not unless we're sure, and even then, it's the most dangerous place for us to try our escape. It's crawling with the Homeland Security men. I don't see an option but to go out the main way." Even Luke, who was normally gung-ho about such things, agreed. Yeah, I had to come to the same conclusion. You all know where the main exit is? We were blindfolded when we came through, but of course I found it on the schematic.
Yeah, said Paul. It's past the lobby. You follow that corridor along for a few minutes, take a left turn, and at the end of that big room is an armored door. That's the way out. There's more than one door, though. Not sure what you call it when there are two, but there's an interior door, and there's another one on the outside with a big space in the middle, like in a castle, you know. So if the enemy got in the main gate, there was another one to stop them. It's a sally port, said Luke. Sally, said Ben. Sounds a bit of a girly name for an armored door. Sally port is the name for the whole thing, the outer door, the inner door, and the space in between. The idea was that if the outer door was breached, the inner door would remain closed and your men could sally to destroy the enemy in the confined space. These days it's just a name given to an area where you can open a main door and a guard can monitor who comes in before securing it and opening the inner door, like in a prison or a government facility like this. I still don't get why they would need Sally to come and destroy the enemy, said Ben seriously. I could see mischievous glint in his eyes, but Luke couldn't. You idiot, Ben, I just told you. Sally means attack or thrust. Ben fell over laughing, and Luke finally realized that he was being tormented. He punched Ben in the arm. We all had a giggle, even given the seriousness of our situation. We were teenagers, after all. How do you know all this about the gates? Luke asked Paul. When we surrendered ourselves, they black-bagged us too, but there was a small rip in mine.
It was in the side, but I was able to shrug and move my head around as we were walking.
So by the time we got to the entrance, it was almost to the front. I didn't get to see much, but I could kind of see the entrance and how the doors operated. Luke looked impressed. So this guard controlling it, where was he? I asked. Paul shrugged. I didn't see anyone controlling it, just a couple of armed guards. Well, that's the thing, said Luke. Sally ports are usually remotely monitored and watched with a CCTV, nowhere near where the shit is going down. As soon as he said it, I knew. The control room on the lower level. Shit. That's going to be a problem. I think I know where it is, but it's guarded day and night. We'll find a way, said Luke. I wasn't so sure and felt the bright optimism I had felt just a few minutes ago begin to fade. He must have seen it from the look on my face and put his hand on my shoulder. We'll work on that part of the plan. Don't sweat it. I nodded. If anyone could work something out, Luke could. Funny to think, he said. A year ago, probably the most important thing we had to worry about was how we would make it to the next level of Grand Theft Auto on Xbox. Yeah, now we're in it, Ben said. We decided that we would make our escape in exactly 5 days. That gave us plenty of time to stockpile the weapons and anything else we needed, and to spread the word to the girls. We would make our escape in the morning, early. We settled upon 3 a.m. on the 5th night. I would come up to mid-level via the cargo elevator, avoiding the Homeland guards in the lobby. I would then make my way to the square, and avoiding the night patrol, move on to the boys' dorm and let them out. Paul, Toby, and Bo would remain in the dorm with the door propped open, while Luke, Ben, and I went to the north wing to free the girls. I knew from my patrols that the long corridor leading to their quarters would be guarded by 2 Homeland guards, so we would face our first resistance there. We might have to kill somebody, or several somebodies, before the morning is over. Are you all up to that? I asked gravely. Luke and Ben nodded with certainty, while Paul also said yes after a pause. He didn't look totally convinced, but I'm pretty sure if it came to protecting his sister Ava, he could and would do what he had to do. We just have to remember why we're doing this,
It's so our sisters and all of us can have some sort of life," Ben added. After we three had collected the girls, we would make our way carefully back to the square. I didn't want to hurt the men patrolling the mid-level, but I knew that it may be necessary to incapacitate them in some way. Once we were back in the square, all four of us would make our way down the corridor to the lobby. It was here we would face more resistance, given that there would be at least 2 Homeland guards patrolling that room. They, most definitely, would need to be neutralized. "It'll be hard to take them by surprise," said Ben. "I know," I said. "I figure I'll be the best person for the job. While it might be unusual to see me at 3 a.m. in the morning, it won't be totally shocking for them. I can say I took a wrong turn or pretend I'm sleepwalking or something." "Dude, really? Sleepwalking? Just stick with the wrong turn story. It's the most plausible. You just better hope it's not Williams on duty. He's no idiot." "Yeah, right. Once we take them out, we head to the exit. But at least one of us will need to go down the elevator to get access to the control room." "But how will that person get to the gates after they open them?" asked Paul. I didn't have an answer for that. In fact, I had deliberately avoided thinking about it. I looked at Luke, and by the expression on his face, I could see that despite his promise to come up with a plan, he too was out of ideas. "It'll have to be me. I've got a pass, and I'm stationed down there." "That's fine, but how will you get control of the sally port? Open it and get out? Surely some sort of alarm will go off. You'll only have a couple of minutes at the most," Ben chimed in. "I'll have to stay." I didn't voice my thoughts. "Don't even think about it, Isaac. We're not leaving anyone behind, least of all you." I didn't argue with Luke. I knew he would never agree with me staying behind. But the more I thought about it, the more obvious it was. I would have to stay and take whatever punishment they decided was appropriate. I could worry about my own escape at a later date. "What?" Ben asked, not quite following our thought patterns. "I have to stay. It's the only way we can get the gates open." "No," the English boy said. "Not on." "We'll come up with another way," said Luke. Paul didn't comment. I thought from his silence and the serious look on his face that he probably knew I was right. Fine," I said, holding up my hands in capitulation. "Let's go through the other phases of the plan and worry about that particular problem closer to time." They agreed to let it go at that, so I got off the topic as quickly as possible. "Now, what about when we're out? Any suggestions?" "Well, first things first. We have to get to the lodge," said Ben. "Yeah," I agreed. "Paul, from the little you could see, how bad was the trail from the lodge to the facility? How dangerous, I mean. It felt terrifying while we were walking it blind." "I know what you mean, although it wasn't till about halfway along that I was really able to see much. It wasn't as scary as you think. Sure, it is pretty rough. It's a mountain trail, after all, and there were some steep drops, but the path itself is quite wide. I think we'll only be in danger if we are being pursued, because obviously we'll be moving faster. It will be tiring, though. It's a pretty tough hike." "Okay, that's great intel," I said. "So, we know what we have to do. You guys start gathering those items for weapons, and I'll do my best to get us some real hardware. I'll also take care of getting a message to the girls and keep my ear to the ground with what's happening outside. We don't want to run into the Chinese as soon as we leave." "Where are we going if we make it to the lodge?" asked Paul tentatively. None of us had really thought about that. "Well, you, Toby, and Bo know the area better than we do, Paul. Do you know of a rural area that's not too far away? One that we could get to within a day or 2 days walking?" He thought for a moment. "Yeah, I do, actually. I think I know the perfect place. It's called Moultonborough. It's west of Plymouth. I only ever went there on a bus, but I guess it's roughly a day and a half's walk from Lincoln. I went there once on a school outing. You know, one of those farm visits they do when you're little. Sounds great. A farm would be ideal if we can find one. The more isolated, the better. Sometime during the week, try to draw us a map of some sort if you can. Sure thing. It's pretty easy, though. Straight down the 93, and once we're in Plymouth, I will know where to go, I think. We were set. We agreed we would lay low for the next little while, but promised to meet every night in the rec room in case anyone thought of anything or ran into any issues. Good work. Let's wrap it up then. I headed back to the barracks after our little meeting. I wanted an early night, not just to sleep, but to mull over the plans and strategies we had decided upon. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, worms of doubt began to tunnel through my mind. Yes, I had managed to lead Luke, Sonny, Ben, Brooke, Indigo, and Allie to safety once before, but that was different. We were in the open then, on the move with plenty of places to hide when we had to. Now, we were basically trapped in a box, in close proximity to a well-armed and clearly dangerous enemy that held all the cards. There was literally nowhere to hide or run. If I managed to get them out safely, I would consider my job done. Facing the inevitable consequences after the escape would be a lot easier for me to bear if I managed to get them all out with no losses.